I tend to move around a lot. You know, the people who are going to see it afterwards, we don't care about that. Whenever I do a talk like this, there's always more empty chairs than full chairs, even in the back. There we go, for the people who want to get out quick, right? And I'm always reminded, most important lesson I ever learned about public speaking. My English teacher, public speaking teacher, Barbara Dooley. I was a sophomore at Barrington High School. I had her for a quarter of a quarter, or a half of a quarter, whatever it was, public speaking. I remember so much of what she taught. So any teachers out here, anybody a teacher here? I mean, what you guys do matters to people like me. And the teachers I had in high school were just as important to my development, to my becoming a writer, as my college professors at Brown. But I heard this story years and years ago, and I never forgot it, about speaking to an audience. And people say, hey, you know, I'll go to an event the day after Lee Child was there. There are all these chairs, right? Chairs everywhere. And, I mean, chairs on the sidewalks. I've done that. That happened to me twice. I followed Lee Child onto it, creator of Jack Reacher. He's a good friend of mine. And he's got 100 chairs. I walk in, I got 4 people, and 2 of them came a day late to see that. I didn't let them leave. I made them buy a book, too. So all those empty chairs, but there's a story about Joey Lewis. In the 1950s, there was no MTV, there was no cable television. Vegas was just really getting started. If you were a big comedian, you played in New York supper clubs. The Basin Street East, the El Morocco, the Latin Quarter, the biggest of them all in New York City, the Copacabana. And Joey Lewis could sell out 2 shows in any of those. He was a great stand-up comic in the 50s. He had a very deep voice because he wouldn't work for the mob. He wouldn't work in mob joints exclusively. So they cut his throat. So it's actually, there's a movie called The Joker is Wild. That's the Joey Lewis story. You'll see that story. You'll see, I don't think you'll hear what I'm about to tell you. But he was playing the Copa. And he gets a call. It was either the Warwick Hotel or the Regency. It was connected. You could go downstairs and not go outside. And he gets a call on his phone. Hello, Mr. Lewis, there's a blizzard. I don't know if you've seen how bad the forecast is. We only have 2 people for the first show, and we've canceled the second show. Do you want us to send them home? He said, and actually it was 6 people. He said, you tell them I'm coming down. Joey Lewis, the biggest stand-up comic of that era, the biggest, walks out onto the stage. There's 6 people. And they're just a supper club, so they're actually at tables. And just like here, they're spread all over the place, even though there's only 6 people. And he goes up to the mic stand, he takes the mic and goes, I left more people than this in bed. And he proceeded to give the greatest performance of his career for those 6 people. Because it meant so much to him that those people came out to see him. I never forgot that story. Here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you 10 rules. By the way, if I do this talk tomorrow, it'll be a different 10 rules. This is today's 10 rules. So if you come back and see me next year, it's going to be a different 10 rules, maybe. Depends what kind of mood I'm in. I want to go over the things you want to think about when you're writing. 10 things you want to think about. 10 other things. I'm going to do that for about a half hour. I'm even going to check my watch so I don't go too overtime. All right, let's see. Okay, so we'll go about 28 minutes because I want to leave time for questions. And if you have a question as I'm speaking, I'll take it then too. Because this is about you, not about me. I'm here for you. The 10 rules of storytelling. I want to start with the most important one of all. The relationship between the reader and the writer it's like a marriage. It's intimate. It's just, remember, you write this book and it gets published, you don't meet most of the people who read this book. I'm never going to meet. But when they're reading my books, when they're reading your books, it's you and them. You and this person in a room. Just the 2 of you. So what I tell people is, one of the rules of writing is to write, when you're writing something, make your audience feel like a kid again. What do I mean by that? We all remember, or at least we've experienced, what it's like to have someone tell you a story when you're a little kid, a bedtime story, or read you a bedtime story. Or when you're a little kid, you can watch the same movie 18 times a day. A movie ends, you start watching it. Today, why? Because you're a kid. I remember, 7 years old, my parents take me to see the original Jason and the Argonauts. That was a long time ago, right? But there were special effects in that movie nobody had ever seen before. And I gotta tell you, I was 7 years old, and that was chintzy by comparison. But when the Colossus of Rhodes steps down off the pedestal and fights the Argonauts and starts stepping on them, I was blown away. And you think that's not going to happen anymore when you get older. And then I got hooked on Game of Thrones. And the thing that made me love Game of Thrones was it made me feel at the age of, well, let's see, 56 to 64, or 55 to 63, those 8 years, whatever it was, it made me feel the same way as I did when I went to see Jason and the Argonauts. I mean, I gotta tell you, we have some Game of Thrones fans in here? Episode 3, final season, The Long Night. For 8 years, we've been waiting for this battle. From just the very first night of Game of Thrones, we waited for this night, this war, this battle. Would it live up to our expectations? It was the greatest 90 minutes of television I've ever seen. The Long Night. Unfortunately, you're going to watch the whole series to understand to get the context. So when you write, the magic of writing, and this is what has kept Stephen King going for so long, the magic of writing is to make your readers feel like they're 7 years old. To give them the same feeling. When you read Blood Moon, and you all can read Blood Moon. When you read Blood Moon, I want you to feel like you felt the first time you read a book you couldn't put down. When you were 7 or 8. My godson, Dylan, now he's 33. He would get, for about 7 summers in a row, 5 summers in a row, whatever it was, he would go to Warwick Hall books, the Walden Books at Warwick Hall, on Harry Potter night at midnight. Get his Harry Potter book, and he'd read that. He'd come home and he'd start reading, and he wouldn't go to. He would not. Nothing else happened until he finished that book in one day. That's what the experience you want to create for your readers. Whatever kind of story you're writing, make them feel like a kid again. The way you do that, number 2, you want to write books that are, when someone reads it, they feel like it was written just for them. Only for them, because when they're reading it, again, they're the only person in the room. It's very personal. But how do you do that? How do you engage that way and make them feel that the book is only for them? That you wrote the book for one person. You published it for one person. You printed it for one person. You, whoever it is. Because unlike watching a movie in a theater, which is a shared collective experience, reading a book is not in a group. It's individual. It's you and that reader and the writer. So when you're writing, how you achieve the 1 and 2, the first 2 things I mentioned, you start with number 3. Every chapter begins with a hook. Don't just think that the first line of the book has to draw the reader in. It does. The first line of every chapter needs to draw the reader in. Somebody give me their favorite number.
3,
7,
8.
Whoa. Okay, 3, 7, and 8, 18. Okay, I'm adding them up. Let's look at chapter 18, and let us see what the first line is. I have short chapters. Hostage. Oops, now I lost the page. I lost the page again. Here we go. Hostage. Fortunately, big print, you don't need glasses. We're on the same side, Rafe said, from the heavy chair he'd been tied to, his hands fastened together by plastic flex cuffs. That's the first line. Every chapter, and how do you do this? How do you do it? It's not enough for me to tell you what to do. I got to tell you how to do it. The greatest two words in Latin, by the way, about writing were coined by Homer, who wrote the first great novel, not realizing it when he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. The first thriller, the first it was the most groundbreaking story and the most influential of all time. And Homer coined the phrase medias res, in the midst. Don't start at the beginning. Start in the midst of something that's already happening. If you start at the beginning and you got to give the whole setup, every single chapter, you're following a formula. You are a storyteller. That's the whole theme of this session. Don't think of yourself just as a writer. Think of yourself as a storyteller. Just like that's the whole point of the first two things I meant, the first two rules of telling a story. You are no different than someone, you're sitting at the edge of the bed telling your kid a story. That's what you're doing as a writer. You are a storyteller. I learned to write. People say, how do you learn to write? I never took a writing class. You know how I learned to write? I was a camp counselor for a whole bunch of years. And I was a camp counselor back in the days when there was no social media. Nobody had a phone. Nobody knew what a cell phone was. There were no televisions in the bunks at Camp Samoset up in Casco, Maine. The entertainment was stories. And it's like you tell stories in a campfire. You got 50, 8, 10, 9, 13-year-old kids. I would tell old Twilight Zones, and I'd remember the beginning and I'd remember the end, but I wouldn't remember the middle. So I had to make up the middle. And more important, pacing. Pacing. When you're writing, unfortunately, you're not in the room when the reader is reading what you've done. So you don't know if you got them or not. When you tell a story out loud to a bunch of kids, when you lose them, you see it in their body language. You feel it. That's how I learned how to pace a story. By learning, by sensing and feeling. And that's what I mean about being a storyteller. When you start every chapter with a hook, you know what? You end every chapter with a cliffhanger. What makes the reader want to go on? Because they can't put the book down. Because every chapter, let's do another number. Somebody give me another number. 12. 12, that's 12. Let's see the last line of chapter 12. To see if it would make you want to read on. Da da da. If it sucks, I'm gonna feel really stupid. She was picturing Alex racing to their rescue when one of the cords twisted tight around her throat and yanked her out from beneath the kitchen table. Cliffhanger. What's going to happen next? That's the whole point of storytelling. What is going to happen next? If the reader is always asking him or herself that question, you are going to be a successful author. You are going to be a great storyteller. Very important, number 5. Very important. When writing, don't write from the outside looking in. Write from the inside looking out. What do I mean? You write from the viewpoint of a character. You write from the viewpoint of what the character sees. So it's not what you see as the author. No, get yourself out of the story. Let your characters do the work for you. When you're describing a scene, describe it based on what the POV of the character in that chapter is seeing, hearing, feeling, experiencing. Not the omniscient narrator. Nobody does the omniscient narrator anymore. It's always seen. Storytellers write scenes from the point of view of characters. So it's not what the author sees that's important. It's what the character sees that's important. On the same subject, you think about, the great thing about writing is you never know everything. Not even close. You continue to learn. Every book I learned something I didn't know before. Well, usually lots of things. And I even continue to learn stuff about writing. And someone repeated a phrase to me, and one of my editors repeated a phrase to me. It was spoken by the great James Lee Burke, who writes the Dave Roby Show novels, one of the great novelists and mystery. I just think he's the best going today. A phenomenal way. And James Lee Burke once said, when writing a scene, always know where the light is coming from. The light, if you know where the light is coming from, that'll help you decide what it is your characters are seeing. Where is the light? Where are the shadows? What can't you see in the scene when you see a shadowy figure at the outskirts of something? You think about all the great work Stephen King has done. And I always tell Stephen King is my favorite author because, man, he's been doing it for so long. He's had some bad stretches, but he just keeps coming back. And he still has that magic. I didn't think a book could scare me anymore. I thought I was past that. I didn't think I used to get scared. Nothing was better than like having nightmares after you read a really scary book, right? Or some scary chapters in the book. And then I read Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining. It's also a movie starring Ewan McGregor. And it's about little Danny Torrance, the boy in The Shining, all grown up and all the problems he's had. And he meets up with a teenager who has to shine as well. Only, as he says in the book, if I'm a flashlight, she's a lighthouse. She's got so much power. And they take on this group of villains called the True Knot, who travel the country in RVs and check into RV parks. And they survive. They're emotional vampires. They suck the life, literally, out of kids who have to shine. And it is, there's a scene in that book where I said, well, they're never going to do that in the movie. They did it in the movie, and they did it even better, but it is a scene that is difficult to read and even harder to watch. But it establishes the whole story of why this young girl says, I'm coming after you. I know what you did, and I'm coming. I mean, that's how powerful she is. The characters. That book terrified me. Absolutely terrified me. And again, it felt like it was written just for me, and it made me feel like a kid again. We always go back to those things. Very important. Everybody, the question you always get asked in signings is, what's your book about? Well, it's easy to say, well, it's two teenagers are all that stands between the earth and total annihilation. Okay, that's what it's about. That's the structure. But what about the emotions of the book? Well, then I have to talk about the fact that the hero, Alex Chin, finds out that he's the ultimate illegal alien because he's not from this world. He's from another world. He was smuggled here from that world in possession of a secret that's the only thing that can save the earth. Only he doesn't know what that secret is. And because of the secret, and because of something that happens really in the first book of the series, which you do find out about it here, because it's kind of, because of something that happens to Alex, his parents are killed. And he finds their bodies. There's an emotion there. So when you're writing, don't just ask yourself, what's going to happen next? Ask yourself, why will the reader care? What makes the reader care about your characters? John D. MacDonald, one of the great mystery writers and novelists of the 20th century, he created Travis McGee, famous detective. Writers would show up at his house in Marathon Key. And they'd knock on the door, and they'd go out on his deck in the afternoon and have a drink with him, because he would drink all afternoon. A lot of writers did. Not me. And one day a young writer asked John D. MacDonald, Mr. MacDonald, you always talk about story. What's a story? MacDonald looked at him, thought about it, and said, stuff happens to people you care about. Anybody can write this stuff. But ask yourself, what is it about your characters that make them likable and make me want to root for them? What is it they've overcome? What is it they're in the process of overcoming? what's their backstory like? And you don't want to give all their backstory normally. You don't want to give it all at once. You want to sprinkle it in. You want to give it in small drips and drabs. So here's what I want you to picture. I don't have any visual aids, but if you picture this, you've got parallel lines, a structural core and an emotional core. Except when you figure out what you're doing, those lines are going to intersect. And the emotional core and the physical core of the book become one. You don't do them separately. You're not telling two stories. Your character is dealing with something that will change them in the course of the story. The beginning, the middle, and the end. When the book ends, your hero is not the same person they were at when the book started. Just checking my watch to make sure. Well, yeah, we're fine, unusually. I will say this, like this is a sequel, I mentioned that. So I had a challenge, a structural challenge, and an emotional challenge, because it was emotional for me. 5 years passed. The book takes place, these two books are actually, this one starts as soon as the last one ends, but it was 5 years. 5 years has passed since the first one came out. So I wanted, Heather and I, my co-author, wanted to make sure that you didn't feel if you picked it up and hadn't read the first one, that you were missing something. So we went back and reinvented some things that we did in the first. Because one of the things that we didn't do in the first was there was no monster. It was a sci-fi story, but there was no monster. This has a lot of monsters. And it has one monster that I actually love. By the way, I'm going to jump ahead to number 9. We'll skip 8 for now because I want to say that monster, Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, once said, "Good writers borrow, great writers steal." I think the greatest movie monsters, the greatest monsters of all, are the monsters you never see, or you only get glimpses of. So your imagination has to do the work. Those are the great monsters. And I always remember, even though I watched these things as a kid, again, there it is, right to the kid in everybody. That's what you want to do? Well, when I was a kid, I was hooked on the series The Outer Limits in Black. Oh my God, it was so good. And it still holds up today if you watch those shows. Unbelievable. And there was an episode called It Crawled Out from the Woodwork. And someone's got a vacuum cleaner and they suck up this weird looking piece of dust and it creates this energy creature, a monster which was stolen. By the way, I didn't just steal it. Lost stole it too. They had the cloud creature, that was the same thing. And in the science fiction movie, Forbidden Planet, the monster is invisible because it's generated, it's a projection of someone's thoughts. So I took those two things and I created my own monster. But I didn't make it up, I stole it. Nothing wrong with stealing. I started my career, all creative people, all artists, start by imitating their idols. Don't be afraid. I have a book called Vortex, my third book. It's Firestarter. It's the same book, just the names are changed and some other things are changed. I had everything Firestarter had because I loved Firestarter, Stephen King, so much. I wanted to write it. I couldn't get it out of my head. That's what you do. You can think you know what you want to write, but if you want to really know what you want to write, whatever you're reading, whoever you love to read. Question?
Yes, sir. I was talking to him.
Isn't this in my conversation? My wife was not talking about it earlier. Oh, really?
I was talking to him.
The other person, that's all right. That's a lot. Well,
Yes. I have an idea for a story that I'm afraid of it being compared to Stephen King's Christine.
Okay.
And, it's almost like kind of a sequel to it, but I was like, I'm afraid of, 2 paragraphs into it, somebody might go, this is just a rip-off of Christine, And
but if you're doing that means they bought it. Right? So what's the problem?
I don't know whether I want to go with it or not, or how to make it original, how to make it, being compared to that,
I think when you have something like that, and when I published Vortex in 1986, there wasn't a lot, you didn't have, of course I sold a ton of copies because more books were sold in those days, but there wasn't any social media, no one was going to slam you on Twitter for stealing from Stephen King. Instead of asking yourself what's the same about the story, it's what can you do differently?
Right, well, I do have a different idea.
All right, there you go.
I do have a different idea.
You know how many times you think Stephen King invented the haunted car story?
Well, yeah, I was saying, but before Christine, there was The Car.
I was just going to say that. A bad B movie which you watch and can't stop watching. Right? This weird looking Tornado is basically what it was. That's possessed by the devil.
It was a Lincoln Mark V.
Is that what Lincoln? Okay, with Tornado, right? Eldorado kind of car, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Now, Christine was Stephen King. That was made into a movie. Great opening with Bat and Bone playing. As Christine is
I
getting
can almost quote that movie. I've seen it so many times.
Yeah. So you're using that as inspiration.
Right.
And you're talking about the beginning. By the time you get further in, and here's the key answer to the question. By the time you get further in, you will find your own voice. You're only using the stealing, borrowing, whatever you want to call it, as the lead-in. But your hero is going to be a different person. He's on a different quest. The background of the car, how the car. There's so much that's going to end up to be different. Because, again, Stephen King did not invent a haunted car. It was also done on the Twilight Zone. With a car, the car that this guy hits, kills somebody.
You drive. Yeah, that's
so it's been done. It's just like evil ventriloquist dummies. Been done 100 times.
Yeah.
And every time it gets done, it works. And there's a reason why it works, because it's tried and true. So don't worry. If you're using something as a jumping off point, but you find your own voice, and that's what writing is. Each story dictates, and this is perfect because again, I'm skipping 8, I'm going to 10 because this will go into it. You find your voice. I just finished a book called Leave No Trace, starting a new series for Minotaur. I'm writing it with another author, not Heather Grant. Although we are doing a second series in addition to this one. If you can't get famous with your own name, you get famous with somebody else's. Can't make the New York Times bestseller list by myself. Well, I'll do it with Heather, right? What's the difference? With Leave No Trace, the book was basically done. And then it occurred to me, who's the villain in this one? How does, well, I know we know who the villain was, but we're attributing an awful lot to the villain we shouldn't be. So the book was finished, and I invented an entirely new character. A whole new character who hadn't even been in the book before. And I went in and put those scenes in, and the book is 100% better. Because this character makes it credible, makes it work. What am I saying? Rule number 10, because we skipped 8. Still, rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. Never think it's done the first time. You have to be your own best critic, and you have to be your own biggest fan. Those two things are connected. Because number 8, by the way, is love what you write. If you don't love what you're writing, well, how can you expect somebody to love it when they read it? You have to be your own number 1 fan. You have to love what you write. And if you love what you write, when I said about organic, here's the word of the day, organic. You write, you let yourself, your instincts guide you. Trust your instincts. Trust the force group, right? Your instincts will guide you in the direction you need to go. Trust them. They won't steer you wrong. So if you feel something isn't working, if you feel a character is, either a minor character is taking the story over, or a major character isn't working. And you say, okay, why isn't this character working? This has happened to me a bunch of times. And, God, what's the connection? Then you realize, wait a minute. If our hero suffered a traumatic event as a child, what if there's something in the background that we didn't know about when we started the book, right? Organic. And now you've got this connection, you've got this villain, you've got the hero, his writing is about drawing connections between characters. And then you realize the light bulb goes on. The traumatic event was caused by the same person. It was the villain that the hero was pursuing. So they're, again, emotional and structural. That's the intersection between emotional and structural. You care about the character more because of the connection with the villain is not just what the hero is trying to stop the villain from doing or to catch the villain before he does something else terrible. It's because the villain did it to the hero originally or did it to the hero's parents. Made the hero an orphan. And now, he didn't even know he was chasing the man who killed his parents. That's a twist. And that's the other thing. Some of the greatest twists in the history of twists were accidents. M. Night Shyamalan. Now this is a bizarre story. What you're going to get from me is purely unfiltered. M. Night Shyamalan is one of the worst filmmakers, storytellers I've ever seen. His movies are unwatchable. The Village. Lady in the Water. The Happening, where nothing happens. The latest one, Old. It got old so fast. But there's this one brilliant film, The Sixth Sense. Where the hell did it come from? Well, he admits, he denies this now, but there was an interview that I read in a small magazine about The Sixth Sense, and he said, well, I was writing a story about a failed psychiatrist who doesn't have it anymore, who gets his mojo back by helping this young boy who thinks he sees it, only to realize that it's true. He admitted in that interview that he didn't realize the hero was dead until he was halfway through the story. And it occurred to him, oh my God, again, organic, the light bulb went off. Oh my God. So The Sixth Sense was an accident. One of my favorite movies of all time, arguably the greatest twist ending in history, The Usual Suspects.
Yes.
The Usual Suspects started off as Brian Singer, the director, and the writer, Christopher McQuarrie. They were going to do a heist film. And they had this notion. All they had was this idea. They had this idea. And that's where all brings the germ of an idea. 5 thugs are all rounded up for a liner and plan a heist while they plan a heist in the room where they're being held. That's what they had. They had a heist. That's it. But they didn't have anything else. They had this great idea for a first act. The first 25 minutes, but they didn't have anything else. Well, McQuarrie, they kept going back and forth. What are we going to do with these people? Christopher McQuarrie had not sold anything at that point. Now he's one of the great screenwriters and directors going today. He does the Mission Impossible movies, the best ones. And he was working as a paralegal. And at lunch, instead of eating, he would go into the conference room. And he would make notes and try to figure out what he's going to do with this movie. The Usual Suspects. Which is, the title comes from a great line in Casablanca. We're rounding up twice the number of usual suspects, right? And he's blocked, he doesn't know what to do, and they've got this big case, and across the wall there's a board. There's all these pictures and everything, and notes and graphs, and he starts making up a story. And then it hits him. A master criminal is sitting in a room, being interrogated by a detective, making up a story that never happened. Inventing a story on the spot. And boom, the light bulb goes off in his head, and The Usual Suspects was born. And there you go. So rewrite, love what you write. I have 11, even though, question.
Did you pass out that paper? I can't.
You can have this time.
No.
No, seriously, it's on my computer. I'll give it, come later after, I'll give it to you. Actually, I'm done with it, so you can have it now.
I'm just gonna take a picture of it.
No, okay, that's all right, already.
What's number 7?
Huh?
What's number 7?
What's number 7?
It's a secret. Structural versus emotional.
Structural, emotional core, structural core. Now, I got a bonus one for you. So we'll see if we have any questions. Bonus. Great. David Mamet wrote the play when it lost. He also wrote the screenplay. When he wrote the screenplay, he realized there were no stakes involved. There was nothing. Why were these real estate salesmen? What were they fighting for? So when he did the movie, he created stakes. They were going to lose their jobs. They're only, and they invented a character who wasn't in the stage play originally. A character whose name is quote Blake, played by Alec Baldwin, who comes in from downtown. It just has this amazing, no, you can't have any coffee. Coffee's for closers. A, B, C, always be closing. As writers, be a closer. Too many people start a story but never finish. You know how many times people come up to me and go, I started 10 books, I've written 50 pages each time, I get stuck. Well, if you've written 500 pages of the same book, you'd be done. Be a finisher. Be a closer. Commit yourself to finishing what you start. Yes, you're going to have, and by the way, there's no such thing as writer's block. It doesn't exist. Writer's block is an excuse not to do something that you should be doing. The answer to writer's block, when you're stuck, is you hit a wall. And when you have writer's block, you just try to keep going through the wall. All you do is turn. A sharp curve. You introduce something that surprises yourself. A new character, something that you weren't expecting. I do this as an exercise sometimes. Now, before I can go on forever, as you can probably figure out. Any more questions? Anybody else have a question that they would like to ask? Because I can still talk.
Why do you have collaborators?
Why don't, honest answer? Because it's pretty close to what I said before. Heather's a very good friend of mine, but she's more successful than I am.
Right.
And we'd always wanted to work together. But I wanted to work with her even more because, again, her book sells considerably more than mine. Mine sell well, hers sell great. So I wanted to team up with someone to have a more successful series. But more importantly, we get along. Collaboration is like a marriage. You've got to get along. You've got to be able to. It's not perfect, but
That's not the actress, is it?
no. That's another Heather Graham. This is the writer, the original Heather Graham. She calls herself. Yes, she did start out as an actress also, so it gets even more confusing. So.
So how do you do the collaborations? Like you alternate chapters, or?
Every collaboration is different. And the way you're describing it, that's the way Doug Preston and Lincoln Child do it. They alternate chapters. With us, I'll write a big chunk. I'll send it to Heather. She'll do a polish. She'll add stuff. I gives it back to then she sends it back to me. I pick up. And by the end of the book, we don't know who wrote what. But here's the thing. Writing a book is easy. Plotting a book out, that's the challenge. But it shouldn't take long. It should be instinctive. When we knew we were doing the second book in the series after The Rising, where I've got paperback copies of The Rising back at my table, if you want to start with that one. You don't have to. A lot of people like the hardcover because it's a better gift. But we were on a book tour for the first one when we started working on the second. We were in Orlando for a book signing the next day, and we went to Disney. Her family was with her. So we went to Disney and we went to have dinner at T-Rex. And there's a 2-hour line, like there always is at T-Rex. Great restaurant. And we went to it was cold and dank. It was January in Orlando. It's not a warm place, as apparently. So we went to the Ghirardelli chocolate shop and had hot chocolate and sat there for an hour and a half. And we plotted out the entire thing. And before I'll get to your question, I just want to tell there was a moment in that conversation with Heather said, wait a minute, what if, greatest 2 words for the writers, what if, she goes, what if, ... And I went, oh my God, that's the book. the whole book fell together at that moment. Question?
My question is, when you plot it out, and this happens to me.
Yeah.
I plot it out and everything's going great, and then toward the end, I have a different ending.
Yeah.
That happens to you too?
I'll tell you what did happen. Not necessarily the ending, because I never know the ending when I start a book. The ending will come out organically. But I will say with this one, I had finished the book, just checking my watch. Oh, we got 5 more minutes. Okay. I'm actually running on time today. I usually go way over. I had finished this book, and I adapted The Rising into a TV pilot for some producers that I was working with, still making the rounds. It's very expensive for TV. It's a lot of special effects. But when I wrote the screenplay, again, this is go back to what I said before. You can't have a science fiction story without a monster. You gotta have a monster. You know what? I talked about the Outer Limits. Joe DiFastano, who created the Outer Limits, used to say the bear. And the bear has to make his first appearance before the end of the first half of the show. The monster has to come out before the 20 or 30, 25-minute mark. So that's when I went back. And again, even though it's not exactly the answer to your question, I reworked the opening to put the monster I had created for the screenplay based on the first book. I put the monster in flashbacks, and then of course it plays a role in the second book. He never appeared in the first book. It never appeared in the first book. But I knew it was something that I needed, and I got it, because I realized it when I wrote the screenplay. So, it's a work in progress. You never get it right the first time. 2 things I can tell you about every book I've ever written. I have this fear, number 1, I have this fear it's not going to be long enough. I'm not going to be able to, this is going to be the shortest book I've ever written. It's going to be 100 pages. What am I going to do? And then, of course, so what I do is, I don't think of writing 500 pages. I think of writing 100 pages 5 times. Think of it that way. That's so important. Don't think 500 pages ahead. Think writing a marathon. If you think of mile 26 and mile 1, you are screwed. You've got to think of mile 2, and then mile 3, and then mile 4. 1 mile at a time. That's how you run a marathon. And that's how you write a book. 100 pages at a time. What was the question? I want to make sure I'm answering the question because I got off track a little bit.
When you write a plot,
Yeah.
and you got the whole thing plotted out,
Yeah.
and you get to the end and it's a different ending.
So, you know what? That means the story is taken. That's such a good question and such a good point. You have to let the story be the story. You've got to let Stephen King, again, I'm using a lot of Stephen King today. He wrote the first half of Pet Sematary and put it in a drawer because it was too scary for him. It hurt him too much. He put it away. George R.R. Martin, we're talking about Game of Thrones. When he came in the book that has the Red Wedding, he did not write in sequence. For the first time in his career, he skipped the scene and finished the book. And then he went back and wrote the Red Wedding. Because he said he knew that if he wrote the scene in sequence, he never would finish the book. The emotion. You want to, you have to let the story dictate what the story wants to be. And there are going to be moments where you go, oh my God, that's not what I was expecting. And then you know you're a writer. You know you're a storyteller. That's how you know. If you just follow, anybody can follow the outline. But when you're willing to divert from the outline and let the story take you where it needs to go, that's how I've written over 60 books. I don't dictate. I don't know what's going to happen. I sit down, I finish one night, then the next day I sit down, I don't even know some days what I'm going to write. I just know it's going to be there because I'm a storyteller. Just like when I'm standing around that campfire, I better keep talking.
That's why Stephen King says, write so many words a day, and then go back the next day and write some more. Keep doing that.
He writes 365 days a year. I think he writes 10 pages a day. every single day, or 5 pages a day, something like that. He doesn't write a lot, but he writes every day. And that's the other thing about writing. The toughest thing to do is when you're not writing full-time, is not writing full-time. Because you can't, it's not something you can do in dribs and drabs. You can't run a marathon 1 mile at a time for 26 days. You've got to discipline yourself to write those 2 pages. That's what Hemingway did, 500 words a day. That's all Hemingway wrote every day, 500 words. If you can write 500 words a day, 2 pages a day, 2 pages a day, at the end of the year, you're going to have a finished book. So commit yourself to writing those 2 pages every day, or 3 pages, or 1 page, whatever's right for you. Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary, Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, would work on the same paragraph for a month. Come on, give me a break, you know? I mean, if it works for them, fine, but that's not me. I haven't got, you know, I'm trying to make a living at this. And besides, I don't need, if I do it for the characters. Do we have any other questions? We have time for one more question, if anybody has one.
So Heather Graham wrote 517 books. I just looked it up.
Is that many?
517 books. You know, she has this series, The Crew of Hunters.
Yes, she does agree with you.
37 books.
Yep.
And 2013, she wrote 4. 2014, 5. 2015, another 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Do they get diluted?
You know, that's a question if to read the books and ask yourself. But I can tell you, I write 4 or 5. I've had a couple of years recently where I've written 3 or 4 books a year.
Yeah.
And the answer is no, because it's kind of like a kid. Is it because I got a lot of kids? One of them,
Everyone's different.
you know, it's like you love all your kids just as much, and they're going to grow up their own way. But just because because I have 1 kid, does that make me a better parent than if I have 5? No. So it's really the same thing. It's you know, it's a great question, and it comes down to passion. If you have passion when you write for your characters and your story, then you have no worries. You can write 20 books a year. You know, Asimov did write 20 books 1 year, I think. He used to write so fast, but it's kind of like going on a trip and visiting a lot of countries at once. You love every country you visit for different reasons. You don't get to France, I love this so much, I'm not going to go to England. I'm just going to go home. So, you fall in love with every story you write. And then, even though you're doing 4 books a year, 4 stories a year, you love them all just as much. And you have just as much passion for them. Whether you write 1 a year, 1 every 5 years, you know, 1 in your lifetime. Many, Ford Maddox Ford, The Good Soldier. Never wrote another book before, that was it. 1 book. 1 book, that was his career. You know, there are other writers like that. You know, some writers would call it, some would like Ford Maddox Ford. Fortunately, he wrote that 1 book. And question to that.
Okay, do you think that the reader of a book would have to feel at the end of the book that the character has, they have to like have a moment of happiness where you bring it all the way? Does it have to end that way for it to be a successful book?
No, it doesn't have to.
You know, you don't want to leave a reader like, well, you bring up George R. R. Martin, who's like the most successful mass murderer, you know, and as a novelist, like, but he like, you know,
You
breaks
all- I
all his
think-
down to tears.
I always end the book on a moment of hope, on a moment of optimism, of a moment of victory, because that's my nature. And I've never written it down. I've never written that ending where something bad happens. That's not why people read it. They have expectations. It's like watching James Bond. I mean, you know, I grew up, that's another huge influence in my life. The James Bond movies, the early ones. There's only 1 James Bond, Sean Connery. That's it. Don't talk to me about anybody else. There is no other Bond. There's not. Don't talk to me about David Gray, 4th of 3. No. Sean Connery was James Bond. You know, there have been a few other good movies that others have done, but there's 1 James Bond. And those movies, those first Goldfinger, Thunderball, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, You Only Live Twice. I saw those movies 30, 40 times. Who remembers the old Low State Cinema, downtown Providence? They used to go back there, used to be double features. My poor father, every 6 months they'd come back with a different double feature, and I'd make him go. I used to love reading the film ads in the journal and the bulletin back in those days, waiting for the Bond double feature to come again, you know. The first movie I ever saw in a theater was 101 Dalmatians, the original. Every book I've ever written is a retelling of that story. Has there ever been a worse villain than Cruella de Vil? She was going to kill 100 puppies to make a coat. Forget Darth Vader. Forget the shark for Jaws. Hannibal Lecter killed a few people. He didn't kill any puppies to make a coat. I have never watched it again because I'm afraid that it won't be the same. But I'll leave you with this. Alfred Hitchcock Presents, there was an episode called The Unlocked Window, when it expanded to an hour. And for some reason, we were at Cape Cod, and I was like 8 or 9, I was alone at home. My parents went to the restaurant bar at the Riviera Hotel and left me alone. There were 4 doors down. Big deal. Parents did that. Now you unleash it. I said kids on leashes now. You see that? Kids on leashes. I never saw such a thing. Look, the dog's happy. I don't want it. That dog doesn't even look like he needs a leash. You know? I mean, and I watched this Alfred Hitchcock, and I don't think I've ever been more frightened in my life. I never watched it again until last year. It was the rerun. They're on Stars, one of those cable networks I had. And you know what? I watched it again. It was pretty damn scary. It aged pretty well. So I don't want to keep you any longer. I will be at my table for the next 4 hours. Come by, see me, grab a book. I have the paperback prequel to this. I've got a great nonfiction book I did last year. I wrote with the Navy SEAL. I've got 3 books that I did in the Murder She Wrote series that I took over for a while. And I've got 1 trade paperback copies of my female Texas Ranger, Caitlin Strong. So some of you, will prefer one. Some of you might prefer Blood Moon or The Rising. Everybody's different. But hopefully, you know a little more now about what it's like to do what I do than you did when we started. And hopefully it will help you. Hopefully you'll take something from it. And otherwise, you get your money back. Not for me, though. Thank you. Maybe the weirdest take because I kept walking out of the picture. That's right. Everybody have a good time?
Yeah.
Thank you.